My name is Shirley Martin. My husband calls me Squirrely, but we'll go with Shirley, okay?
Shirley.
Yeah.
Classic.
I'm passionate about local history. There has never been an actual comprehensive history done of Ucluelet. Elsie Hillier did an amazing little write-up about her years growing up here and the past history. And my mom was involved in the Recreation Commission. Then they put out a little booklet called Cedar Bark and Sea, and it's full of little stories about the history of Ucluelet. So I kind of grew up with that. Merry Christmas, lovely lady here in town, has done 4 little books about sort of little special things about Ucluelet. Like there's some with recipes, there's one about music. There's been things written, but no comprehensive history. I just think that maybe people just don't know what a colorful, fascinating history we have, and I've tried to include that. We live on the calm harbor and we know what it's like on the turbulent seas. Although I do have some stories of drownings in the harbor, more than you would expect. But also I was thinking of the First Nation history, the havoc that's been created by colonialism. And then there were times when Ucluelet was in dire straits during the time of the settlers, when people were struggling to survive. And then there's been all the other things like the war in the woods is, turbulent seas. What has happened with the fishing industry, commercial fishing, definitely turbulent seas. I live right on the traditional territory of the Ucluelet people, and so that is hugely important. And that's how I start the book. And that was sort of a difficult thing for me to do because it's not my story to tell. I am descended from settlers. And I discussed it with some First Nations friends, and they encouraged me to do it. I also had First Nations friends vet those chapters and those sections of the book and make sure they were in agreement with what I'd said. And then I was extra lucky because Harbour Publishing provided the proofreader, and she is an indigenous woman, and she's also a sensitivity reader. So that was an added assurance. I also used a writing style guide written by an indigenous individual about different things that we wouldn't necessarily think to capitalize, which should be capitalized, certain wording, appropriate wording. So I felt much better about it once that had been vetted. I grew up listening to stories about the West Coast. Like my dad was one of 7, and they grew up like going up and down the coast in their dugout canoes and getting into all sorts of things all the time. My uncle said, "Oh yeah, so that's one time your dad he had to kill the cougar with an axe," and stuff like that. Nothing that a West Coaster would do ever would surprise me. Something that was really interesting is the extent that the Victorian newspapers used to go to for information all up and down the coast. Like now you don't even find that much about what's going on right in Ucluelet necessarily. But the old colonists, they used to have, it was like shipping news, and they used to have all this information, every little thing that happened in the West Coast. And when I was researching, I would find all this stuff about my dad and my grandfather and my great-grandfather and all the things they were doing. One was when my grandfather and a group of men were lost at sea and had been given up for dead, and a couple of them got into a boat and paddled all the way in to Leonard Light. And then the Ucluelet lifeboat was involved. They went up and retrieved them. That's how they survived. It was a rough life. One example of many is Whiskers Thompson, so William Thompson, and he came here from Ireland, and he was a very colorful character who did pretty much everything in this town. His is one of the many names on the cairn down at the district office, the list of names of pre-1900 settlers. And he had a really interesting life, and he was a rum runner, which is always fascinating stuff. And he actually, at some point, went off to China And then they left China with, they don't really know what the cargo was, some mysterious cargo, and they were not seen again. So he never came back. But his descendants are here. We often didn't have doctors here, and we would be between doctors. And so it was usually the women of Ucluelet that stepped up. And so there was this one lady, Mrs. Parkin. She had a dress store called the Vogue Shop, and her husband had Parkin's shoe store next door. And she would just go out in the middle of the night if the woman was in childbirth or if somebody had a problem. But she had like sort of a little mortuary in her house as well, because where do you take bodies? Sometimes there'd be like a body laying out on the table waiting to be washed and stuff. And one night she was dealing with that, and there was a knock at the door, and it was one of the airmen from the seaplane base, and his wife was not well. So she said, "Oh, I'll come and just let me get my coat." And while she was getting her coat, he saw this body, and he said, "Mrs. Parkin, there's someone laying on your table." And she said, "Oh, don't worry about him. He's dead." And so the guy just passed out. So, yeah. Another one that did that was Agnes Tugwell, who ran Tugwell's Bakery. So, and that was at the top of Main Street there. And their house is still there on the corner at the Tugwell house. The earliest doctor's name was Dr. McLean, and he was brought in as a doctor for the First Nations, but he served the whole area. He would go by canoe across Barkley Sound or by little sailboat and that sort of thing. And he also still has descendants here in Ucluelet. One of the blurbs talks about me being fourth generation. So I'm fourth generation West Coaster, because my great-grandfather and my grandfather settled in Port Renfrew down the coast. So my dad and his siblings all grew up there, but Dad and three of his brothers ended up in Ucluelet logging and fishing. My parents were already living in the logging camp here at the end of the harbour, but my mom had problems with childbirth, and there was no road, and it was a bit dodgy getting out if you had some emergency. So I was born in Victoria and brought back by steamship. Great memories of being kids out there, being Kennedy Camp kids and just running wild. And there were quite a few families out there back then, so it was really fun. My husband, he's heard a lot of the book, because as I was writing it, I would read little sections out, but he's now reading it cover to cover, and he's going, how is so-and-so related to so-and-so related to so-and-so, and how are you related to them? And sometimes someone would be widowed, and then they would marry into another family. And Eric N.O. Tam, he's an amazing author. He wrote a blurb, very nicely wrote a blurb for my book, and he's a long-time Ucluelet fellow. And he said, you really need to do like a genealogical big chart so we can kind of track how people are interconnected in this town, because it's quite complex. So when I was 17, so I worked on the road that summer, and then I went off to UVic for 4 years. And then I graduated and got married. We came home for Christmas, and we were at my parents' place, and I was pregnant out to here. And my brother said to him, "We need a mechanic at M&B. Are you interested?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "What?" I ran a daycare in the house, because I didn't want to go back to work when the kids were little. I just wanted to be with them. So I'd have like 7 little kids running around and troop them all down to Little Beach, you know. And when my kids started school, then I went and I worked in the elementary school and then the high school, working with special needs kids for 23 years, I guess. And I also worked at the transition house as a child and youth care worker. Yeah, I know lots of kids around town, and they're all grown up now. Well, the road was a really big one. That was the first one, because we were such a close-knit community before then. Everybody knew what everyone was doing. Everyone looked out for everyone else. So that brought way more people in. The original road went through in 1959, and that was a really big deal, because the whole town drove out over this gravel, you know, full of potholes and stuff. And then that brought people in. But once they paved it, it was just crazy. It was too much. So 1969, so I was 17 years old, and I was just graduating from high school, was heading off to university, and happened to get that great job. And then, of course, the national park. When the national park came, that made huge changes as well, because so many businesses and so many individuals had to give up what they had out in the park. I mean, I think it was a good thing. I just imagine what it would be like hot dog stands and grand hotels and all along the beach. So I think it's wonderful that it's all been preserved. But I feel really bad for those individuals, especially the older ones that lived out there, and I think that the government should have grandfathered them in. So I worked at the old Ucluelet Inn with Robin Fells, and it was amazing. But that was sad to see the end of that. When the Canadian Princess came in, it meant a big change because of the sports fisheries increasing hugely, because they flew in plane loads of people, or brought busloads of people in. It provided a lot of employment, which was great. And again, when it left, it was a big loss in many ways. So that was a sad day. We went down on the beach and watched them tow her away, and then she got all torn to pieces, which was sad. The war in the woods was big. I grew up in a logging camp. I come from a long line of loggers, and as I've said before, I understand the passion for the environment. One of my friends who got arrested is very dedicated to protecting the environment, and I really admire that. She said at the time, because we've talked about it, that their training during the blockade was to not focus on the loggers and blame the loggers. It was to focus on the corporations. But I guess that's true, but it didn't come across. Like, we didn't get the message. It had a huge effect on Ucluelet, and I think that the rest of the world was so intent on preserving the trees, which, I mean, there needed to be changes, and there were definitely areas that needed preserving, but it really impacted Ucluelet and the families. I really just feel like there's been so much support for this book, because you need a lot of people involved, right, to give you the information. I interviewed a lot of people, and a lot of people vetted sections of the book for me, and there's been such a great response. And like I say, I think we needed this history written down, because we're losing our elders and stuff, and I think people just want to know more, because people love Yuki. I am so lucky that Harbour took it, because I didn't know if I'd get a traditional publisher. My previous 5 books have all been self-published. I just couldn't see publishing this one on my own. It would have been really expensive to do. And I was so thrilled when they took it on. I was lucky that they went with my vision of the cover, and that Mark Hobson was willing to allow his beautiful image, because he's such a fabulous artist, and I was thrilled I got my request for that. And then the designer put my memories with a different background. So as you sort of go through, if there's something with a gray background, it's my memories, and the rest is history, as well as I could do it. Yeah. But as Margaret Thompson said when I was interviewing her, she said, well, would I swear on a Bible? Probably not. It's the perspective, right? It's people's memories, people's stories. And even I found contradictory documents as I was researching, so that makes it hard. And I had to cut things. I thought I would just cut my own memories. That would be easy, because I could just pull them out, and they said, no, they kind of like that sort of through it. I feel bad that I left chunks of things out, but what do you do? It's a hardcover book, and it's also available as an ebook, apparently. Something will be lost in that, because the pictures just don't look as good on an ebook, but for some people that works better. They originally had said they would put 100 photos in. I got 140 in, so I'm pretty happy about that. They're still missing a few that I wish I'd gotten in. I'm on the board of the Ucluelet and Area Historical Society, so some of the photos are from that collection. Some are from my own collection, and some I got from the Port Alberni Museum Archives and the Royal BC Museum Archives. And then different individuals I know, some of whom I interviewed. Barbara Schramm did the maps. So when people are reading it, they can trace around the map of the harbour or look up and down the coast to pinpoint where the story is at that point. And she's an amazing artist, and she did the covers of all my other books. So I was pleased that she was involved in some way by doing the maps. It will be for sale here in Blackberry Cove Marketplace, Image West, and the Crow's Nest. So, and Tofino, they have it at Mermaid Tales. If you go on Harbour Publishing's website, there's a link called Buy Local. It's magical. You just click on it and put in your postal code and it will tell you the closest stores that have it. Well, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. I love it for its natural surrounding, but I love it for the people. And I think we have just such a close-knit, supportive community here. But I mean, you know, look at it. Look at your photos. Why would you ever want to live anywhere else, right? It would be tough.